They're welcome, and what brings them here today? They're hoping to learn about the day that we're talking about, World Indigenous Day, designated in 1994. And so for a number of years, this has been a very important part of the work of the United Nations in developing better relationship with Indigenous people, things that led into some of the later work for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other source documentation, foundational documents that help to guide us in reconciliation and what the work is today. The reason I say it guides us in reconciliation is because it is at the forefront of the work between various groups and the opportunities that they have had to have their concerns voiced to the larger international delegations. And now as we step into a more pointed time for Indigenous issues, we have had Idle No More, we have had the uncovering of grave sites at various residential schools across the country, and more that will happen as many First Nations are finally undertaking some of the ground penetrating radar and study that needed to be done after the signing of the residential school settlement agreement. It's in, I believe it's volume 2 or volume 4, that they talk about the grave sites, the death registry, the accounting of the bodies and the people who were lost, didn't come home, and subsequently those that were traumatized by that and passed that trauma on to their children and to their communities. And so we are a little more aware of the issues at hand. It's taken us quite some time to get here, and yet the work still needs to continue. And so I thank you for being part of that work by joining us tonight. And we'll go through a couple of talks that we have had with various people who have taken part in our sessions for the Urban Indigenous Circle and the work that we continue to do for the United Church of Canada, as well as other denominations. So I'm just going to light this smudge and offer prayer this time for our opening, for our gathering here. We always offer prayer at the beginning of all of our sessions in our traditional way. This is part of our practice for Indigenous people who follow in the traditions of our elders. And what their teaching is that when we offer this smudge, when we offer this blessing and this prayer for the work that we do this because there are many things that we carry on our heart. There are many things that we carry on our conscience. And we do this to cleanse ourselves and bring us into accord with the Creator, and to offer a prayer, to offer a time of reflection and remembrance that we are children of God, each of us, and that the work we do here is important as we live out our journey here. We are each blessed with a purpose, and in that purpose, we are called to offer our gifts and our knowledge into these circles, that we might learn to live together, that we might learn a better way. And so let us pray. Creator God, merciful one who is always in our hearts and in our minds. We know that your presence is among us. We know that you have guided us through this space. We see the natural outcome of our way of life, the conflict and the catastrophe of a pandemic that shows us that we are not living in accord and with right relation to all creation, but that we need to find a way to balance our interests with the interests of those around us. And so in our prayer, we pray for those that are struggling. We pray for those who are challenged and those who may not be listening, may not be hearing. That you might reach into their hearts and help them understand that we are all one people. We all suffer to the consequence that we embed upon each other in our actions. And so we must learn to tread lightly and honestly and with good intention if we are to live together. Jesus Christ, when Chabarchese, Jagawaka, Hokuhari, Chinarizi, Nari, Chabichin, Nagahais, Naguachetnia, Ichiath. Amen. So we take the time, and I'll just do a brief introduction of the topic today. What we are coming here to speak a bit about and offer some insight. So this is World Indigenous Day today, August 9th. My name is Tony Snow. I'm the Indigenous Minister for Chinook Winds region for the United Church of Canada here in Southern Alberta. We did our opening smudge and prayer, and I'd like to offer this prayer from Dr. Reverend Cecil Corbett, who passed away last year from COVID. He was a pioneering presence for the Indigenous Church, for all Indigenous churches, and at the forefront of Indigenous theology. And so this is his prayer from a book of Reformed prayers, A Gratitude for Creation. Creator God, your presence is as the wind, the breath and sustainer of life. We are grateful for being a part of your beautiful creation. Rugged mountains, rolling plains, and uncultivated deserts. We thank you for the birds of the air, the animals, the fish of the sea, for purity of air and water and healing medicines that remind of the need for holy virtue in life, spiritual and physical. In your holy mystery, you have revealed that we are God's children, a wonderful mosaic of humanity with different cultures and heritages. We have work yet to do, to work for truth and equity. We pray that we might always be found faithful, reflecting your love. Cause light to overcome the darkness in this world. Be present, O God, through your Son, Jesus, in whose name we pray, amen. And so this prayer focuses us on the works of creation and all our connections around us and how important that is to the work that we do, rehabilitating relationships with one another and rehabilitating our relationships with the world around us. This is very much an environmental message because we must be attuned to those lessons if we are to learn to overcome some of the challenges that we see. World Indigenous Day began on December 23rd, 1994. The United Nations General Assembly decided in its resolution that the International Day of the World's Indigenous People should be observed on August 9th every year. The date marks the first day of the first meeting, 1982, of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations. And so this day becomes a very important hallmark. On this day, people from around the world are encouraged to spread the UN's message on the protection and promotion of Indigenous rights, rights of Indigenous people. It's also a day to raise awareness to protect the social, economic, and political rights of Indigenous communities. And so it's this point that the lesson this day is leaving no one behind. And in that call for a better justice system and a better system of equity amongst the Indigenous people with their neighbors, it's calling for a new social contract, but in a way that I think makes it problematic that we need to balance the relationships first. With the UN, they had their meeting at Madrid last year, and I had the opportunity to go as a representative of the United Church here in Canada, and to work with some of the groups, international, especially faith groups from around the world that also attended. And some of the groups that were represented from where the original groups that were to host the event in South America, who came and talked about their connection and their condition in that country, in the various countries that are connected to the Amazon, and how that, in particular, began to resonate with me, that we had a different approach because in Canada we have had apology, we have had a coming to terms and a settlement agreement for the residential schools, which is also an understanding around colonial practice with Indigenous people and the rights of Indigenous people. And so trying to rectify that in a way that gives us the calls to action, calls to the government, calls to the church, calls to communities, municipalities, education centers to become more attuned to their understanding of how they impact Indigenous people and their communities, especially health-wise, with mental health issues, with social epidemics that are happening, from alcoholism to drug use to mental health and other issues that fester on these isolated communities. And so there's been an attempt to address. And what I think is interesting or important out of this is that in these countries, in countries that are not Canada and countries that are in Central America, South America, when they talked about their rights and they talked about their struggle at the UN conference in Madrid, part of what resonated to me was that there was no coming to terms yet with some of the injustices. They still live in a situation where they're very vulnerable to some of the action of their governments that want to displace Indigenous people, that want to eradicate Indigenous people, and to take over their lands, take over their rights, and basically erase Indigenous people. And so it's a very different situation than we see here in Canada, where since it was only since the 1950s that the Indigenous people had the right to retain a lawyer. And so from that point, making that effort to put in land claims, be autonomous within their own communities, and to stand up for themselves and have the rights recognize them back, saying, yes, you have the right to protest, you have the right to do these various actions. And not in any benevolent way, but sort of a begrudging way. Whereas in these countries that I was talking to at the Madrid conference, the line that resonated with them was one that they could not implement. So in the church, United Church, we talked at the Indigenous Gathering in Rama, Ontario, 2019. And in that discussion, what was put forward by the elders of that circle was the phrase, "nothing about us without us." And this means that they wanted to be integrated and they wanted to be part of the discussions. They wanted to have some input on things that would affect them. And to have that sentiment or that statement mean the same in Central America, in South America, is a very different calculation. Today, we see the Pope Francis's encyclical on Beloved Amazonia, talking about the importance of trying to recognize Indigenous rights and Indigenous people. And one of the things that it runs up against is that they are not advocating for change within governmental systems or power relations. It's merely a support for Indigenous people where they stand. And a lot of the history in those areas are connected to massacres, connected to the killing of clergy and other situations where standing up is putting your life at risk. Here, it's a little different because we have the body of rights that people enjoy that are not always fairly and equitably discerned. And so this becomes one of the touchstones for our discussion around what leaving no one behind really means. How do we ensure that a system that is set up to recognize rights and affirm the presence of a people, how can we do things that will allow for their full enjoyment or the expression of their rights in particular situations? And so it becomes very problematic, I find, that we're asking for rights in a system where we're not equally engaged, where we are not equally adaptable to those particular rights of any particular group. And so we need to have a better balance. And I think that for me, a lot of that talks to some of the multicultural and multi-ethnic diversification in Canada that will help to actually express some of that understanding between races, between religious groups, that can finally have a dialogue and begin to present a new phase of normal, a way of understanding our relationship together that is reminded of history, that is living out history, and that is cognizant of changes that are yet to come. And so it's not trying to be static to the powers that be and say that this is what it's going to hold forever. We need to work together to empower one another to find a better way to work together.
Today we observe the World Indigenous Day, August 9th, 2021. This year is the theme of Leave No One Behind. The discovery of the two 15-plus children from Kamloops Residential School and others are pressing, and they are immediate on our minds. Our hearts go out to the families, to the survivors, and to the children themselves. I was able to participate with many women, elders, young people that are walking across this country to observe the two 15 children and more, as well as to go make a pilgrimage to Kamloops Residential School. And as they walk through our traditional territory, we are escorting and honoring them. As they are in our lands, we are hospitable to give them safe passage and honorings. And I think that as part of our commitment is we look at those calls to action. We talk about the honorings and reburial and the loss that we keenly feel. We can make reparation. We can help our families in this very direct way. That the recovery of these children, that they're laid to rest in a good way, with our ceremonies, with our prayers. So again, I want to thank the institutions and churches that have been vital to helping us build reconciliation. As we work with the many groups, as we work with our First Nations governances, as we work with our own traditional matriarchs and societies, we're very keenly aware to help heal in light of the children. A tumultuous history has been unfolding before us. The stories of our ancestors have come true, invisible proof of the recovery of these babies. And we want to make sure that no one gets left behind this year or any year going forward. So, Ishnish Pine Mach, I would say all my relations, and as we observe forward, take the time to look at the TRC recommendations, take the time to have reconciliation and go forward in a good way. Ishnish.
We're here on World Indigenous Day, and as a residential day school survivor, I just wanted to share a few reflections. As we go through this process of settlement, there's things that the public needs to be aware of. So one of the effects is that not all survivors got their settlement. For example, my father passed away before his settlement reached him. Even though the settlements were completed, a lot of the summary budgets were very short-sighted and curtailed. So what I mean by that is, if you look at the size of the financial settlement in Canada, there was about $4 billion that went to the settlement process. Of the $4 billion, 3 went to various organizations, law firms, trust companies, different holding groups, accounting firms that have received that money. So it did not get to the survivors. So I want people to know that. The other thing is that as we move forward and are doing the claims for the day school settlement, the people who are making settlement claims and doing the process now are having to relive the trauma. So they are re-traumatized by telling their story. And as a result, some people who have beat their addiction or they were able to overcome their alcoholism, they have gone back to their addiction in order to deal with their pain. So these are very traumatic events that are happening to people across the country. And so on this World Indigenous Day, I would like to share that it's not all easy. Apart from that, those who are able to come through the healing, I find hope. And for me especially, I have been able to work with psychiatric counseling, psychological counseling, and at the same time I've also needed to work with Indigenous elders. The key there for me has been ceremony, the importance of participating in ceremonies, the importance of healing, and the importance of being able to share my own story, my own narrative. And so as we move forward from this World Indigenous Day, I ask for prayers for all the community. I ask for the communities for healing as they deal with the children, as they're going to rebury and look at the repatriation of the bodies across the country. So I ask you as a public to support the survivors, to look into your community and see what you can do as a result of this knowledge now that you know what has happened to the Indigenous people. What are you preparing to do about it? What are you called to do? And how will we work together? So I want to just thank you for allowing me to share this message and to share this time with you. Thank you.
Good day, my name is Tony Snow. I am the Indigenous Minister for the Chinook region of Southern Alberta for the United Church of Canada. I welcome you all on this World Indigenous Day. We're taking time to commemorate and remember the contribution of Indigenous people. The theme this year is Leave No One Behind, which resonates for many tribes that are left in poor circumstances because of their relationship with the colonial people and the settlers that came in. It took a lot from the Indigenous people and did not share equitably as our ancestors wanted. We live with the repercussions of those times, and those continue to affect the coming generations. As we see with the mass graves that were found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, as we see in other communities that have done their ground penetrating radar to find more bodies and more incidents of these tragic injustices, these acts of genocide that affect our communities. And so as we commemorate today, we remember that justice is still fleeting for our people. And as we work toward justice, it is a long road. It's a long road to understanding, a long road to working together, to building hope, to building a better future for our children and their children. There's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot that we need to be mindful of as we grow into our reconciliation modalities. When we had the Two-Spirit person, Harlan Pruden, come to visit us at Hillhurst, one of the things he talked about was reconciliation, was not just leaving these notions of injustice aside, but to working proactively to change the past through our future and to do things that will rectify the situations that people, many, still live in. As we learn to be better in community to each other, there's a lot of opportunity that exists where we can change our behavior, change our reactions, call each other to account, and our political officials who represent us and represent our voice, to let them know how we feel about things that are going on, that we want change and that we want to promote a better future that is inclusive and diverse and open and welcoming. As we talk to our experts today, we're going to be hearing a lot from their perspective on what we've been missing and what we need to do to make change for the future. Gloria, if you wanted to add anything about today, the theme of today in leaving no one behind.
Yes, I can interject. I've added in the chat 9 things that you can do to support the rights of Indigenous peoples and to focus on priorities. As Indigenous peoples sometimes and most times can't choose their way of life. So they are in social systems, they're in governmental systems, they are in poverty, and they need control over their education, healthcare, and in terms of, most importantly, in terms of their land, the land that they
are in and around or on, it must be secure. As Indigenous peoples need to be involved in discussions of this land use. Without it, Indigenous peoples have no livelihood and they have no identity, no means of survival. And again, like one of the points was to apply the law to ensure rights are protected. Well, I question whose law, the natural law. So that may be limiting. So when we look at these ideas, yes, it's great to talk and to build public awareness. It's great to have the implementation, but it's always coming back to for whose benefit is this? It's for the future generations. It's for our Indigenous people. It's to talk to our elders. It's to always come back to and know that in a lot of cases, the responsibility is for all. When we talk about the 215 plus, the responsibility, where did that fall? These are hard questions to ask. And yet we still have the dialogue. We are still coming forth with the trauma and the pain and wanting some type of reconciliation and healing. So I think that it's very important to discuss these wider conversations, a deeper understanding of the natural law, a deeper understanding of our connections to land, our holistic point of view. So as we go deeper, it's so important to do those land acknowledgements. It's so important to do those cultural awareness pieces and to talk to Indigenous people, to become good allies and to become knowledgeable about how to help them in the best way. Because not a lot of, like, I know when we were doing discussions and talking with the people walking to Kamloops, a lot of people wanted to help and then it just sort of fell to the side. Well, there needs to be a bigger discussion of let's have a national day of mourning. Let's have conversations around the 215 and let's not drop the ball on this because, you know, as of today, I think there's more than, you know, the 3,200 or more that were cited in the TRC reportings, and then each nation in Canada and the US that are doing their level best to recover their babies. And like Lakota, they had a beautiful service of 9 children that were laid to rest in the traditional star blanket. Very moving, very traditional, very apropos that they would be laid to rest in a traditional way, in their traditional lands, with their families and with their loved ones. So that sort of idea of comes back to TRC, the recommendations, you know, Articles 71 to 76, the rights of assuring that our families, that our burial ways of honoring are observed for these children. That's educating yourself on how that can happen. And people that are going and lobbying to government and saying, you know, our healthcare system or our child welfare system or the things that we need to do here to help our children needs to come into the control in our own management as Indigenous. When I read these things, I was thinking, you know, wow, we can't control our way of life because we're living on reserve. We still fall by the Indian Act. And in previous times when Tony was speaking, we actually had to have a pass to leave the reserve in the early part of this century. And, you know, if you were caught off the reserve and you had your regalia ready to go to a powwow, you'd be, you know, your outfit would be confiscated and destroyed right in front of you, and you would be sent back to the reserve and you would not have a chance to practice your culture. Similarly, with the residential school, you're not allowed to speak your language. You're not allowed to be cultural. So in this day and age, to have this Indigenous World Indigenous Days, we realize we're all brothers and sisters. We are all on this same path of equity and respect. And that's the important thing to know, how to do that in a culturally appropriate way, in a way that Indigenous people will find useful.
No, that was good. Thank you. issues that are arising from the deaths and the genocide that has happened, and then trying to look at a way that this tagline of leaving no one behind really makes sense, and how do we fit into that idea of a cultural shift, if there is one. And it's difficult because we're not participating in a way that is giving us that respect or the ability to change systems. And so I'm just going to go on to this quote that I have from my father in his book, These Mountains Are Sacred Places. Here he says, according to oral tradition, we are taught that the Great Spirit or Creator created the red people or indigenous people for a purpose and placed us on this great island, often called the New World by the immigrant invaders. We believe there is one Creator. We believe in the one Creator. Though we speak to hosts of languages and dialects and observe diverse cultures, dances, songs, and ceremonies, and live in very different climate zones, we believe in one Creator, the Great Spirit, the Great Mystery, Wakanta Ka, who made this great island and all things surrounding it. And so this idea of we can be diverse, we can have our own ways of doing things, and this is how we existed before the time of contact, that it is possible to respect one another in a way that allows each to carry on the things that they need to do, the gifts that they have been given by the Creator, in order to share and bring to light some of the broader understandings. And this is what the environmental movement is a lot about. There's a lot of shifts to change and trying to get Indigenous knowledge into some of these systems, but it's trying to wrangle them in a way that makes sense to a European lens. And that's not necessarily what's going to be helpful. I just want to read a portion here that my father wrote. It says, our ancient philosophy tells us that a day is coming when Indigenous people of this land will teach other peoples, other nations about life, the importance of life in harmony with the cosmos. I believe that day has arrived. It is not only humankind that inhabits the earth. There is a host of other living beings who inhabit this world with us. The Creator made all things for a purpose, according to all our traditions and teachings. Indigenous philosophy and teachings are about the sacredness of life. There is not one day set aside as holy. Every day is the Creator's day. Every day is holy, and everything He made is holy or sacred. We are taught to respect all things that are the Creator's. We live in a world with other sacred beings. When you speak, honor them by speaking the truth. Do not tell a lie when you speak, because the trees listen, the rocks listen, the waters listen, the winds listen, the animals and birds listen. Indeed, every word is heard by Mother Earth. In essence, all of creation is listening and hears you when you speak. So we are taught in our native traditions to always speak the truth. And when you speak truthfully, you honor yourself in all creation. And so this idea that we are embedded and deeply ingrained in the practice of creation, in the way that creation rolls out its purpose, we are part of that story. Just want to add a brief part here for the dissertation, for a reflection that I recorded from for World Indigenous Day by our friend in Hawaii, Kauanoi Huumani Wananui. So I'm going to play that right now.
Aloha and good morning. Thank you so much for having me join you in sharing about our understanding in being Indigenous and knowing that there is a community of people here on Earth that aren't aware of their own indigenuity, and that leads to kind of the outcomes of what learning about Indigenous means and what it brings out of us once we are aware of what that is and what's going on in the world. And so my name is Kauanoi Ho'omanawanui. I'm from the island of Kauai as well as the island of Hawaii Island, which is also known as the Big Island. And I was raised in both islands back and forth and a few of the islands in between. Well, we have 8 that are inhabited by Native Hawaiians today amongst the plantation immigrants that were brought in the early 1800s. So our community is quite diverse here in Hawaii, and a lot of our influence are very colonized as far as these communities being immigrant based, that it had controlled housing, controlled economic systems, controlled unions for how the work was participated in economically, and the diversity that each community got to participate in as they were placed, they were segregated. And so today I'm really excited to share kind of my understanding in my journey of what it is to be Indigenous and what the appreciation is in acknowledging such a day in August. In accepting, as we have our rites of passage here in mostly Indigenous communities, we hear about how our life journey taken on and the influence from our elders and ancestors, and how we see to have our lifestyle be played out in the cultural traditions and the practices and the stories. And so luckily I had accepted my kuleana, or responsibilities, at an early age. And so I'm able to serve our ancestral community as a state historic preservation officer, taking care of all the human skeletal remains or burial sites, or here in Hawaii we call it iwikuna. And in that light, I am an employee of all the state of Hawaii, and I have to serve all the constituents in all their concerns regarding their ancestors. And more so, it's on the opposite end, when we should be preserving more of our ancestral stories and connections genealogically. We're more so trying to save that sacred information and be on the forefront of development, ensuring that the buffers and the bulldozer line, as we like to pull it, because a lot of times we get to our sacred sites and the bulldozer is there, pushing them back, buying us time to learn about what is going on, because it is very foreign to us, activities of stealing, lying, things that would be very colonial based that we can see, because those are practices that we've identified in those selective groups. And because we don't understand those ways, it really sets us back, not only as a state official, but for constituents when we're trying to plead with the agencies at hand our importance of our ancestors who lived here before us, how they got there, and what we're still doing here in this land that our Creator put us in. And a lot of times that's our determination, our only determination, is that we were led to a specific place by our Creator, saying, this is the place that you're going to hold sacred to your hearts and develop your language and your people, and I will be there communicating with you. So I'm enlightened to be in that position, working with families and having them to understand that their narrative and their respect to their ancestors is true, and also screening out those that are not true, because we have a lot of different circumstances that are similar to grave robbing, but it's almost, I can't put words to what it is, but it's very a stealing fashion that we're not familiar with. And then ensuring that the government is put in such a way that it accommodates those with less of a voice, because they're not trained to share all this information to be on hand. And that's in part to one of the ways that I can see certain things playing out with the vast community and the diverse, because it's not only Native Hawaiian burials that I have to deal with. I have to deal with 4 different generations of Portuguese, Puerto Rican, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, all these people that have made this place home due to the immigrants who were brought in by our community of faiths from the larger continents in their colonial settling here in Hawaii. And I can get back to that maybe later on, but
Mhm.
the immigrant populations were brought here by the missionaries. And so that's very influential as far as being diverse with those communities and having them understand the layers of different type of ethnic groups that are here that have all the same treatment. I'm not going to treat a Hawaiian any different than a Portuguese or a Chinese or a Japanese. And then in another respect, that's one audience. And then in another respect, back to 1993, our queen in 1893 was illegally overthrown by a missionary
Mhm.
descendants company. And so we've been illegally occupied ever since, even with statehood and whatnot. And so in 1993, the 18th General Synod decided that the president at the time from Cleveland, Ohio, come down to Hawaii and announce his apology to the people. And it took a few people to present this resistance to that General Synod to speak up at the national level and say what happened over and over for them to give us some sort of acknowledgement. And so in 1993, in similar to this circumstance, the Reverend Paul Sherry gave an apology. And with that, he put it in 3 factions. And one of the factions includes putting a certain amount of money, about $1 million, towards the Association of Hawaiian Evangelical Churches. And this particular association is driven from the churches that were created when the first missionaries came in 1820, and they established churches over the years. I would say at least 60 in my head that I can think of that were built by Hawaiians that were lived nearby and buried with, as we did in our previous temples. So I am now today the president of that, almost maybe 2 or 3 years. So being the youngest person on this particular board and then becoming the president, that has enlightened me to share the journey that I've taken going to school in Canada as a Native Hawaiian, working alongside you all First Nations people, and how we do it with the power of God, because that is a source to play it with, as I understand, with the ecumenical movements of Northern America and pushing our resistance through and enriching our people through their spiritual nature. And so that to me, in a way, it has been the toughest, tougher than even my servancy to the human skeletal remains of all of our ancestors, in working with the generations of today who are multicultural, intercultural, trying to manage a Native Hawaiian developed congregational style, which they later called it Kalavina churches, which is translated into Calvinist or Calvin. So it's very Calvinist, but we practice nothing congregational. So our understanding of what we call ourselves are very colonized. So I understand, the more I understand from our First Nations community in Canada and abroad about the movement with UNDRIP, and also just any resistance. And I love hearing that it's an ecumenical movement, because we were priests prior to the settlers coming. And so it would be in our nature to reveal how we worked with our people in our spiritual nature and environment with those that are saying that they have the same creator and they're working on the same things as well. Because we were very open to that in the first or second company. By the 12th company, we had nothing left. So I think that clues into the constituents and the congregations that I work with in trying to be a young learner and then do the work for the people already with the energy that I have, and then savor the people that are left. A lot of the slow genocide has occurred here, so we have no elders left. A lot of the people in leadership are of the age of my parents, and they're the most colonized out of the last 4 generations. And that has been quite the experience just in that service. So I'm grateful to learn more and see more, because these practices aren't too common here. We're still in fear of something. So I'd like to see how that progresses the more we are liberated in finding our own truths, really. And I only can share that too, and stick with the ancestors' foundations that I know of, and that seems to take me through any trials and tribulations in trying to relay or communicate with those extremely colonized. I wouldn't say they're elders yet, but they're coming of the urge. Even though the elders are past, it doesn't make them elders. So I think that would be the one thing that I can specifically engage in. With this information, and being enlightened with it by you all. So in my understanding of UNDRIP, I think it's article between article 26 and 28. I saw UNDRIP to be in two parts. One, for the self-determination for the indigenous people, and two, it's about the land and the provisions.
Yeah.
And what I see with the model that we have in the United States of America is you can have your way, but not your say. And we'll go ahead and document pre, during, and post. And then that'll just be in history, put in history. However, there's the consequence of those communities at hand that are definitely shaken up from the first incident, the second or third. And so early on early on with the settlers, our relationship with the land slowly changed. And because our monarchy at the time really took to the British nature and the ever-evolving American nature in what the ecosystems and how the land use would be spread out, they really utilized the paper model of a Western template and tried to make it work here in Hawaii. And in Hawaii here, we stem from mountains and the dualism amongst our different environments, the water, the trees, the air, everything that goes along in nature, we're a part of and we are of. A lot of our names today are named after instances, events, places, smells, winds, colors, a lot of activities that have to do with nature and documenting time. So when we go into circumstances of our oral traditions and we've put them in what we call hula in our culture, and it's a dance, a very traditional dance. And it's very sacred because it carries the story. So it became easier if the story was put in a dance a lot of times to memorize, because in memory, you can only, I can only imagine, since we come from an oral tradition, how would we be saving all of these things? And of course, over time, there's, like speed reading. You can go ahead and generalize certain instances that you feel or see that you can somewhat grasp what the story is or what's having to come or who's been born or what's happening. And so our without our land, we don't exist. So in a way, with those two parts, our self-determination is the land and we are of that land. And at the end of our monarchy, after they realized how much they were colonized and torn up and trying to do the best with the people, but they were introduced to alcohol, so a lot of wrong decisions were made, a lot of alcohol was consumed, and they were so good at they documented all of these things. So now we know the stories of how decisions were made under the influence, and a lot of those village stories happened like that when the titles came up. A lot of alcohol was on a long night, and then we had to move after that night, And so with our land, it's very circumstantial that's all we know, and that's our main relationship. And for us, we wouldn't see any other difference. So when foreigners come, and when they did come, our name for foreigner is to hold your breath or to be without breath. So it doesn't matter the color, we just weren't able to breed with you. And so that was rare for us because we spoke through breath. No matter what the vocalization would be with the breath, it was sincere, and you would feel a lot of that happens when indigenous people come together. We can do a lot of nonverbal communication. We can understand each other even though we're not familiar with the language. Yeah. A lot of things that we can feel out that may be foreign to others. So it was very we didn't understand. You know, we couldn't breathe what they were breathing, and I think that's what it had to do with the land, because we only could live from the land, so it was very confusing, I think. But in today's circumstance, our most recent declaration, as you could say, is to Mauna Kea or Mauna Awakia. That particular mountain is known for many as an ancestor, as a person, as a huge human skeletal remain. And in my position, working for the Historic Preservation Division, and I do the verifications of families and human skeletal remains and that connection. So they have to show me their genealogical connection and then where this person actually is. And so I've been brought applications that say, this is the mountain, this is my genealogical connection to that mountain, and this is my ancestor.
One of the things that I think is important in what Kauanoe is saying is that there's a nature of cultural adaptation and being able to make that adaptation oneself. How we approach culture, how we approach change, how we approach religion and other aspects, how we embody those and integrate that into what we know and how we believe. And those are very important touchstones for Indigenous people on how we talk into space, how we talk into these relationships. And so there's another video from a Maori speaker, Erua Kiipa. He will offer a bit as well.
Tēnā koe te rangatira I pōhiri mai I ahau I tēnei rā, ko Iruwera Kepa tōku ingoa, ko te aroa, Ngāti Maniapoto, me Ngāti Rārua, ngā iwi. Kei raro au, kei konei au, kei tauranga moana, kei raro I ngā rekereke o te maunga o Mauao, no reire mihi ana ki ngā tangata whenua o konei o tira, kia koutou e aku whanaunga e ngā iwi take o Amerika, tēnei te mihi maioha, tēnei te mihi aroha kia koutou katoa. Ka huri ake au ki te reo tuarua. Greetings, kia ora, hello, my name is Iruwera Kepa. My genealogical links trace me back to Te Arawa, Ngāti Maniapoto and Ngāti Rārua here in Aotearoa. And I currently reside in Tauranga Moana under the umbrella of the Korauwa, or the eponymous ancestor, which is, I guess, the physical embodiment of that eponymous ancestor is a mountain, Mauao. So I do want to acknowledge Mauao. I want to acknowledge the people that occupy, and I guess that have the not the authority, but we call it mana whenua, that they have the authority, they have the prestige of these lands. So I do want to acknowledge them as well. But more importantly, I want to acknowledge you, Tony. I want to acknowledge this connection, and I'm really looking forward to, I guess, to discussing what's presented before us today. So, ngā mihi kia koe. Yeah, exactly. When we look at the significant landmarks within those tribes, they are the physical embodiment of our ancestors. We have a river, we have mountains, we have the land, we have the waterways, all those different, I guess, landmarks. As I mentioned earlier, they're the physical embodiment of our ancestors. So we feel we have, for Indigenous people, we have that innate connection with these landmarks. We don't see them as, I guess if we were to put on another lens, a mainstream lens, they might see those landmarks as an opportunity for development, but we see our ancestors. So I guess in the last 140, 60 years, Māori have advocated and campaigned to protect our ancestors, and that, I guess, that's still continuing today. So We have a special intrinsic bond with our landmarks, with our mountains, with our waterways, with our rivers, with the land. And when we think of the term whakapapa or genealogy, we are the people of the land. So of course, Māori do everything within our power. We do everything we can to ensure that that is protected.
There was a case that went forward about the river, that the river was declared a person.
Yes, yep. Well, yeah, there have been examples of that in Aotearoa. So the Whanganui River, that's declared by law, by statutory law, that's viewed as and declared as a person. So when a council of any other outside agencies are impacting the Māori, and the Māori is the life force of that river, they must treat that as a person, as a real person. So I guess by taking that approach, 99% or most of the time, you wouldn't be able to get away with any unlawful or any unlawful acts that impacts on the Māori of that river. So there's one example there in Whanganui, that's the river, and just, I think it might have been at the end of last year, there's another mountain called Taranaki, Maunga Taranaki, which has also been legally declared as a person as well. So yeah, that's quite, I guess it's quite not transformational, but it's huge. It's, if we talk about the protection of our ancestors and the physical embodiment of our ancestors, it's for Māori, it is welcoming to see the law acknowledge our landmarks as a person or as an ancestor.
I think it's very insightful in terms of the idea of from Kauinoe talking about adaptation and of working within especially religious systems, synods and different groups, versus these efforts by the Maori to embody that by their understanding of the land and the recognition, the enforcement of that principle in law, and how we begin from that point to understand that there's a depth of understanding that we're bringing to this, and that there is a different tradition or different way of looking at the world that will impact if we begin working together. And so it is through this adaptation and through this enlightenment that we can then start to work towards better understanding of the systems, better way of working within these systems. So we're going to, maybe Gloria, if you wanted to say a bit, I'm going to pull up a slide here.
Well, I find it really interesting that the worldview, the Indigenous worldview, how we're all connected, and how we view the earth as our mother. And so the Maori themselves have taken on to name that river as a personhood and as to be in one with nature. This is our view as well. And everything is holistically imbued. Everything has a spirit, everything, the animals, the birds, all our creation is our brother and sister. And so it's interesting that this idea still reverberates way over across with the Maori people. And that's very empowering, that these ideas, the creation stories, the way that we learn our genealogy, our history, is always tied to land. It's always tied to a sacred place. Like when my father wrote his book, These Mounds Are Sacred Places, It was about going into communing with God. When we go to these areas, when we go to Iamnathka, those are our temples. And we go there to seek a vision, to pray, to be sacred, to be holy. And those are things that we need to protect as well. Those ideas of land and the rivers and our mother, Inamakoche, our Mother Earth. It's a conservation thing, yes, but for Indigenous people, it goes beyond. It's a familial relationship. It's the breath of us and the bones of us and the land all interconnected. So I'm really happy that, to hear that the work they're doing, our brethren over in, as Maori peoples, they have a very strong culture. They have a very strong identity. And with our Hawaii brothers and sisters, with Ka'anawi, she is working with all the different nations and doing such great work. When we work alongside and enlighten ourselves about the struggles of all Indigenous, our Hawaiian brothers and sisters, our Maori brothers and sisters, are Indigenous to where they are. We were in a class and we learned about the Taiwanese. And just at the Olympics, we had a big display of the Japanese Indigenous peoples. They did some beautiful songs and they did some beautiful dances. And it was really heartening to see that despite colonization, despite the attempts to eradicate us, we're still here and we're still a viable part, and in some cases leading the way in terms of conservation, in terms of environmental preservation, because it's all tied to our culture, our language, everything. It doesn't separate from one thing. And I think that's really exciting to know and to see. We say this again and again, and yet at the UN level, it seems to feel like you're not getting anywhere, but I think we are. I think we're making a bit of an impact. And as we continue our efforts through the church, through decolonizing and through reconciliation works, we will go further. I'm hopeful. I'm pretty sure of that.
Thanks. I'm just going to read a quote here from the book again. It is a real inspiration and challenge to live the traditional life as we view these hills and mountains, these valleys and rivers, to be close to nature and to be reminded that the Great Spirit made all these things. It is good to return to the sacred land of our forefathers. As you look over the past century, it has been like a long, cold winter for my people. As far as our religious life is concerned here on this great island, the sacred fire of our religion has almost been put out by the people from foreign lands who do not understand our belief in the Great Spirit, the Creator. In our sacred fire, we have been told, if our sacred fire had been totally extinguished, indeed, we would have been a forgotten people who had once lived on this great island. And so this understanding that we are connected to these practices, and to these practices, they give us an understanding of the world around us. And that really is what we are bringing to the table when we talk about leave no one behind. When we talk about leave no one behind, we're trying to say that these interests have a value, and that these interests have a application in the relationship and in our understanding of the world. And so that filter, it becomes part of the story of this land, of this relationship, how we live that out. And it really needs to be tempered by the experience and knowledge of those Indigenous people who have developed over millennia these systems.